Israel adopts a disputed law amidst protests, prompting questions about the effort to curtail the judiciary's powers. Mass demonstrations against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's divisive ambitions for judicial reform have accompanied the development. The administration and conservatives feel the measures are vital to restore authority to elected representatives rather than interventionist judges, despite claims to the contrary made by detractors that the broad reforms will damage democracy and encourage institutional corruption. The development has been accompanied by large-scale protests against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's contentious goals for judicial reform.
Despite assertions to the contrary made by opponents that the extensive reforms will harm democracy and promote institutional corruption, the administration and conservatives believe the steps are essential to returning power to elected representatives rather than interventionist judges.
In Israel, there have been widespread protests against the modifications that have been suggested.
The administration and conservatives consider the amendments vital to restore power to elected representatives rather than interventionist judges, despite claims that they would damage democracy and encourage institutional corruption.
The Supreme Court will no longer be allowed to overturn executive branch judgments by applying the legal concept of reasonableness, which justices previously used to overturn legislative and executive branch decisions, under the new law.
According to a recent article in the New York Times, rationality is as follows: many judicial systems, including those in Australia, Britain, and Canada, use it as a legal standard.
A decision is declared irrational if the court determines that it was taken without taking into account all pertinent information, without giving each relevant consideration, or by placing an excessive emphasis on irrelevant information.
The shift, according to Netanyahu's administration, will give elected legislators more authority than unelected judges, so fostering democracy in the nation.
However, opponents view it as a step that would enable the ultra-right government to implement conventional and illiberal policies without the need for judicial intervention.
Due to the large protests that occurred in March, the ruling coalition has so far decided to only pass the legislation that deals with the legal idea of reasonableness. All other reforms are currently on hold.
In January, the government first made its intentions to alter the legal system public.
In addition to reasonableness, 3 additional significant modifications have been suggested.
First, the government seeks to make it possible for the 120-member parliament, or Knesset, to overturn any decision made by the Supreme Court with a simple majority of 61 votes, unless such decisions are made unanimously.
The second is a measure that would give Congress a bigger say in who gets appointed to the Supreme Court.
As of right now, judges are elevated to the Supreme Court by a committee made up of professionals, justices, and lawmakers.
According to a report by the Associated Press, the new shift would give lawmakers a majority in the committee, with most coming from the right-wing and religiously conservative ruling coalition.
Third, a new law that would let ministers select their own legal counsel rather than hiring outside experts.
The Israeli right-wing and conservatives have traditionally viewed the judiciary as a left-leaning obstacle to their legislative agenda.
In order to overturn court rulings that broadened social reforms to protect the LGBTQ community and prohibited earlier governments from building Israeli settlements on privately owned Palestinian land, for instance, the current ultra-right coalition is pushing for more power. They
essentially seek to pass a number of legislation to restrain Israel's notoriously fiercely independent court.
Non-parliamentary organizations have resorted to the streets since the number of opposition legislators in the Israeli parliament is insufficient to halt the reforms.
Large protests have been occurring around the nation since December of last year, when Netanyahu's coalition took office.
Moments after the new assembly was voted into office, massive demonstrations started on Madani.
The NET stated that in Jerusalem, where Israel's parliament is based, demonstrators blocked a major thoroughfare as leaders urged opponents of the legislation to take to the streets from wherever they were.
To persuade Netanyahu to temporarily halt the reforms, a group of trade union leaders, academicians, senior doctors, and military reservists banded together earlier this year. Now, they're threatening to strike once more.
A significant Israeli rights group, the Movement for Quality Government, has petitioned the Supreme Court to overturn the new legislature, creating the potential for a constitutional crisis, according to a report from the New York Times.